So let's get things started. What's new in Angular 18 is our program for today. So first, a few words about myself. My name is Alain, or just Al, and I'm a Google developer expert in Angular and Google Maps. I've been working with Angular and AngularJS for a very long time. I started back in 2011 with AngularJS before Angular 1 was even officially released. And these days I'm a consultant and trainer at angulartraining.com, where I teach Angular online or in person at, I travel to companies, to their offices to teach Angular. And I also speak at conferences all around the world. And parts of one of the things that I do and that we do at Angular Training is that we have an Angular certification program with 3 different levels from beginner to expert. And it's the only certification available that's made by Google developer experts in Angular, meaning all of the things you go through, the exercises, the quiz, and a final interview is going to be with a Google developer expert. So that's a great opportunity to test your skills, improve your resume, find a new job, all of these sorts of things. And so, yeah, if you want to give it a try, feel free to go to courses.angulartraining.com and you'll see all of the information you need about these certifications. I also want to add that this workshop is free. You don't have to pay anything to attend, but I always welcome if people support my work with a cup of coffee. So if you go to buymeacoffee.com/angulartraining, that would be fantastic. Just to keep me going. I need coffee, I need caffeine. And so I'll put that link in the chat. But yeah, that's how you can reward me for this session if you enjoy the contents and learn something new. All right, that brings us to what's new in Angular version 18. So version 18 is a major version, and these major versions happen every 6 months with Angular. So there's a lot of new stuff. The first thing that you probably noticed if you tried to go to the Angular documentation in the last few days is that Angular IO is deprecated in a sense and is now officially being replaced with the new website, angular.dev. So this is the transition to the new website with the new documentation. That website was in beta since v16, but it's now the official new home for Angular. So angular.dev is a new website and angular.io is not maintained anymore. You can still access documentation for the older versions, so 17, 16, 15, by using the version number as a prefix. So you can do, for instance, v15.angular.io, and you would get back to that older version of the documentation for Angular, but from now on, everything is going to be on angular.dev. So that's the first update. In terms of other things that officially become part of the framework, we have all of the new syntaxes for the control flow in our templates. So with v17, the Angular team started adding those new blocks. So these are called blocks, the if block with else. You can use that in your HTML template. It works. It was in developer preview in 17, but now it's not in developer preview anymore. It's officially part of Angular production ready. So you can start using those blocks in production. The syntax is not going to change. They are stable. So this applies to if else, which has a much nicer syntax than, using ngIf, where the else syntax was a little bit complex. And the other benefit of the if else block is that it supports else if as well. So you can have multiple different cases, if, else, else, which makes things a lot easier. And this applies to all of the blocks that were released in Angular 17. So this means that the for loop is also available. So for users of users, it requires a track parameter to help Angular with performance. So if you come from React, for instance, it's something that React also requires, and Angular, 16 and before with ng4 kind of suggests that you can use a track by function, but with that new block syntax, you have to pass a some criteria of unicity for your items in the loop. So here, user ID, and that improves performance. And with that for block, we also get the empty case, which is going to display something if the array of items is empty. So this is also out of developer preview and 100% production ready in Angular 18. The same goes with the switch case syntax. So instead of ng switch, you can now use @switch block syntax and have same features as before, but in a syntax that's easier to read, easier to understand, and doesn't require importing any directives. And that's one of the main benefits of these new syntaxes, by the way. It's not just changing the way you write your components, it's also reducing the number of dependencies, because when you use ng4, ngif, or ng-switch, these are directives that you have to import. So you would import them either individually. If you do a standalone component, for instance, you can import ngif, ng4, or you would import common module that imports all of them at once. But these blocks, they are not in common module, they are not directives, they are part of the compiler. And as a result, there's no cost in using them. There's no extra tax that you have to pay for use them, because it's part of the compiler. And so you gain a little bit in terms of performance as a result. Especially with the for loop, it was improved to be a lot more performant than ng4. So it's not just about syntax, it's also about better performance. So this is all in Angular 18, and the main block, probably the most important one, I would say, that was introduced in v17, and that is also out of developer preview in Angular 18, is the defer block. So this defer block is used for lazy loading, in a sense, right? We used to have lazy loading at the module level or at the component level. Now we can really have our own lazy loading configuration inside a component, inside a template of a given component. So using @defer, you would be able to lazily download the code that's in that block, which here is just one component, but it could be a block of HTML with several components in it. And all of that would be packaged separately by the Angular compiler and downloaded on demand when the following criteria are met. And the good thing is that we have full control over when, so how we defer. So here on viewport, meaning when that block becomes visible in the viewport on the user, we display it. So that would be typical thing to do if you have to scroll down to see some components, because it's a very long page. On viewport would only load the component when it becomes visible, when it becomes part of the viewport. And there's many options. I have many blog posts on that. If you're interested, you can ask me, I'll give you the links of all of the options of defer. There's so many of them that it would take maybe half an hour to just describe all of the options. But it's very powerful because you really decide when you want to defer and also when to prefetch, if you want to prefetch the code. So pre-download it when Angular is ready to do so. So here prefetch on idle means that as soon as Angular is not doing anything, is not busy, it would start downloading the code for this lazy loaded block, which in that case is just one component. So you can really fine tune how you lazy load. Could be on a click, could be when something becomes visible, decide when you download that code. And in the meantime, you also have the ability to provide a placeholder that's going to be displayed before the deferred view is loaded. You can also display a loading, image or component while the component is being fetched and rendered, and have an error block to display if there's any error while loading this lazy loaded piece. So yeah, it really gives you a lot more options than anything we had before with lazy loading. And that is also out of developer preview and fully available in Angular 18. So just that all comes from Angular 17, but is now officially part of the framework, stable, meaning the syntax won't change. You can use it now and the syntax is going to remain stable. So that was the first chunk of updates, all about these new blocks, all available in Angular 18. Another big part of what the Angular team is working on these days is server-side rendering. There's a lot of work on server-side rendering, and it can be a little bit confusing because there's a lot of new vocabulary that goes with it. And so I'm going to try to cover some of that, but I want you to know that there's already 37% more apps that use server-side rendering since the release of Angular 17. Because it's so much easier now to do server-side rendering with Angular that a lot more people have started using it. And there's many benefits to server-side rendering. Why would you do that? Reason number one would be speed, because the idea is that when you do server-side rendering, your application is first rendered on the server side, right? And as a result, when a user navigates to your app, they get the entire HTML right away. So there's no downloading the app and then displaying things piece by piece. You get everything at once. So that's pretty helpful, especially if you have static content, pages that are always the same. Why you rebuild them in every single browser if they're always the same, right? Server-side rendering allows you to do that once for all at compile time, and then on the server to refresh it, and then you're good to go. So speed is a big thing. Search engine optimization, SEO, if your content has to be indexed by Google search, usually a page that's pre-rendered on the server has all of the content right from the start. So makes it easier to be indexed, easier to be parsed, and faster as well, which tends to give you more points from a search engine optimization perspective. And the last item, which is kind of related to speed, better performance. If you're tracking the performance of your application using a tool like Lighthouse, for instance, you'll notice that as soon as you start using server-side rendering, everything improves. Everything is better. And I have an illustration for that, I think, on that next slide. So this is my typical Angular training application, my license plate store app. Before using server-side rendering, what would happen is if you navigate to the app, initially you just have a blank screen, right? Because you make a request to the website, and the website is downloading the index HTML, which is empty in an Angular app. And then it downloads the JavaScript, and then it starts loading a component, and then more components. And then we see the images starting to show up. And it takes a few seconds before everything is loaded. So my score at that point was 88%, which is good, but it's not 100. And all I did was enable server-side rendering for that website. And when you enable server-side rendering, what happens is that because your website is pre-generated on the server side, right from the start, when you load the app, you have all of the HTML. And because you have all of the HTML, the website is ready instantly, right? It's just super fast. And then the only change is that images get displayed one by one, but the user can see something and really quickly start interacting with the website. And so just by adding server-side rendering, my performance score became 100. And that was the only thing I did was tell Angular, hey, use server-side rendering now. So that's pretty powerful. And that's a good incentive to try at least server-side rendering and see if it makes a difference for your web applications. So if you have an Angular project and you want to use server-side rendering, if you have an existing project and it's at least Angular 17, you can do ng-add at angular/ssr using the Angular CLI. And this is going to enable server-side rendering for your app. So nice and easy. Just run that command and it's going to take care of everything to enable server-side rendering. If, on the other hand, you start a brand new project, you can just do ng-new with the option --ssr, which I think is a question no matter what. So even if you don't use --ssr, Angular CLI with Angular 17, 18, and 18 is going to ask you, do you want to enable server-side rendering? And if you do so, then you end up with that, with that feature in place, which is pretty good. So this was all released with Angular 17, but it's always being improved by the Angular team. So they're always working on improving performance. And the main feature that was added in Angular 18 is that, so what they call the event replay feature. And the idea is that, as we saw earlier, when you use server-side rendering, your app, the HTML of your app is pre-rendered on the server. And so you navigate to the app, you download all of that HTML. But the thing is, it's just that. It's just static HTML. There's no JavaScript behind it at that point. And so the user could start interacting with the app and maybe click on buttons or links before your JavaScript and your Angular code is actually ready, before Angular takes over and adds listeners to all of these links and components. So that could be a problem because the user could click on something very early and then nothing happens because Angular and JavaScript are not there, are not ready. So in Angular 18, what we have now is this notion of event replay, which means as soon as the HTML gets loaded, there's a small amount of code that's going to capture all of the events that the user runs in the browser. So it's going to start recording user events right away. So if the user starts clicking around, all of these events get recorded. And once the application is hydrated, so what the Angular team means by that is that Angular takes control of the static HTML that was rendered on the server. So Angular becomes, a front-end app again and takes control of these components, and all of the event listeners are in place and all of the data bindings are in place. Then this event dispatch that captured all of the clicks is going to replay them. So we don't use any action from the user. So that's the main addition in Angular 18. The fact that if your app is so fast that the user can just start interacting with it and click around, as soon as Angular is ready, it's going to replay those events and take care of them, which is very important. And so, that's really the main focus of the Angular team: server-side rendering, improving performance, and making sure that all of these features are as easy to use as possible and as fast performance and easy to use is always the key. So that's the main update for server-side rendering in Angular 18. With Angular 18, we also have many different API updates in the framework, small updates in different parts of the framework. For instance, if you use content projection with ng content, so in the past, when you used ng content, it was like an empty tag, right? And you would have to project something into it. Now with Angular 18, we have the option to have default content. So here I have an ng content, and my default content is just the text hello. So if nothing gets projected, then hello would be displayed. And we have a second ng content here, where the default would be unknown user. So same idea. If there's nothing to project, then Angular would default to that text or component or anything you want. So that's a nice little addition to the API of content projection to make things, a little better, right? In terms of forms, so one of the work in progress that the Angular team is still working on is making everything signal compatible. Because when you use reactive forms, you know that you have access to a few observables from RxJS, and the idea with Angular 18 and the next versions is to really make everything fully compatible with signals instead of RxJS. So a first step in that direction, to some extent, is to have a global event emitter, I would say, which is still an observable for now, but might become a signal in the future. And so this is a new property added to all form controls, form groups, form arrays. That's called events. And this events observable gives you any change in value, touch state, pristine state, valid state, all of the different properties that a form control has: valid, invalid, touched, untouched, pristine, dirty, would be emitted in that events observable. So if you subscribe to that, you can receive many different events, and you're always up to date with what's going on in that form group or form control or form array. So it's a nice little addition, and it's just a preamble of what's to come in forms in Angular. So that's for the forms API. In terms of routing, there's a new option that was added to the router config, which is a redirect function. So when you create a path, if you're in your router config, you can use redirect to and pass a function as a param. And that function can return just a string with the path to redirect to. So the function allows you to define some business logic, and based on that business logic, you can decide to redirect the user to one place or another. So in this example, if there's a user ID, we go to the page for that user using the user ID as a param. Else, we go to a not found page, for instance. So it's using functions just like guards and pretty much everything router based now instead of classes, using functions, so resolvers, guards, and now redirect supports functions. And another big update in terms of API is that Angular Material 3 is now fully stable and compatible with Angular 18. So all of the material components are standalone, compatible with server-side rendering, new look and feel using the latest version of the material design spec. So it's all beautiful, all modern, all, lazy loadable one by one because they're all standalone. So yeah, a very big upgrade and updates in Angular material. And yeah, if you go to the new website, you'll see that just visually you can tell, wow, it looks a lot better, a lot more refined than earlier versions of Angular material, which is pretty good. So new website, completely updated, different themes and colors. The components remain the same as before, but they have a slightly different look and feel now. Look more modern, I would say, and yeah, fully compatible with server-side rendering and standalone Angular components, which means better performance, possibly lazy loading, and everything we talked about earlier applies to Angular material as well, which is great. So that's for the API updates. And now, as you probably know, what's been going on with Angular for the last few major versions is all about signals. And signals have been in developer preview in v16, became stable in Angular 17, and with Angular 18, we get new stuff. So introduced in v16, out of preview in 17, further improved in v18. And yeah, the Angular team is really betting everything on signals. So if you're not using them, I would really recommend to take a look and start thinking about using them and upgrading to at least v17, even better if you can go to 18 to start using signals. Because, the main argument, so one is, of course, it's easier than RxJS. It's easier than learning about observables and subjects and operators and all of that. The concepts of signals are a lot easier to understand, a lot easier to learn. But the other thing that's going to change everything with how we build Angular apps is change detection. And so what you see on my screen now is the default change detection with Angular. So default change detection, if you click a button, so this is a component hierarchy that you see on the screen, many different components. And if I click a button anywhere in my app, right, could be here, could be here, could be here, doesn't matter. The default change detection of Angular with Zone.js, all it can do is Zone.js is going to detect that click and it's going to tell Angular something happened, right? And then Angular has to check every single component from top to bottom. So no matter where the click happens, Angular is then checking everything one by one, going down the component hierarchy. And of course, this works, and it works pretty well because that's how our Angular applications have been built for years now, and performance is pretty good. But with signals, the idea is to have really super precise pinpointed change detection, where we have a hierarchy of not just components, but views. And views are subsets of HTML templates in our components, if you will. So for instance, when you use a for block or an if block, these are new views, right? And the idea is that if one of these views is using a signal, then when the value of that signal changes, Angular knows exactly which view to refresh. So it's not even about components, it's more precise than that. It's the only thing that's going to get updated is the view that uses that signal. And so you can imagine how much more performant this is going to be, because instead of going through the entire tree of components with signals, you can really pinpoint your changes to just the small parts of HTML template that have to be updated when a value gets updated. So that's a very, very big deal. And this zoneless change detection is now available in Angular 18. So for the first time ever, Angular can work entirely without Zone.js and without requiring you to change the way you code things. So it's experimental, right? It's an experiment with Angular 18, so it's not stable yet. It's not even developer preview. You can consider this like an alpha version, I would say. So you can use it for testing purposes and see how it works, but not in production, not yet. And yeah, the idea is that in your application Bootstrap, you would use this provide experimental zoneless change detection. And if you do so, and you use signals in your app pretty much everywhere, then you can remove Zone.js entirely. It's not going to matter anymore. Everything is going to be based on signals, which is really powerful and can. So it really shows that the Angular team is fully committed to that path of making signals the way that we build Angular applications. So this comes on top of all of the APIs that were introduced in V16 and V17 on signals. So how to create a signal, how to create effects, computed signals, and then turning the inputs and the outputs of our components into signals as well. So yeah, 3 reactive primitive, 3 functions for signal, computed, effect. Now, if you use that and you enable that zoneless change detection, you're pretty much all good to go. And you have an application that can work without Zone.js. You can remove that dependency, disable it, and your application should be fine. So that's a big step towards zoneless change detection. That is also sometimes called signal-based components. So yeah, in many of these things are still in developer preview. The input function for components, so replacing the old at input. But this again is going to be all signals now. If you use that function, which enables that change detection that we talked about. Model is another function that came with Angular 17, I think. Allows you to create a 2-way data binding on any property. And that's the other thing that's very important with this. You know, in Angular, we learned that changes go from top to bottom. And so you're really supposed to have changes go from a top component, a parent component, to child components. This model kind of disappears now with signals. And that's why you can have true 2-way data bindings that work. And changing a child can then update a parent that maybe updates another parent or another sibling. It doesn't matter anymore. Angular will not complain about it because signal-based change detection means that Angular knows exactly which templates depend on the change. And it doesn't matter where they are in our component hierarchy. So yeah, really a big deal what's going on here with signals and all of these new APIs that relate to them. And output. So the output function is a replacement for the at output decorator. Same thing, released in V17, but remove the dependency on observables, because this output is not an observable anymore. It's not an event emitter. An event emitter was an observable. So again, showing the Angular team's commitment of getting rid of RxJS and Zone.js as much as possible. And that's something they actually announced at ngConf a few weeks ago, months now, maybe a couple months ago, that the future for Angular is very bright. Angular is growing in terms of popularity, is used in more places than ever before, and features are coming at a pretty fast pace these days. So these are the main things that the Angular team is working on for the future. And this is a picture I took at ngconf. So I was in the attendance, and that's what the Angular team showed on screen during the conference. And zoneless, so that's the signal-based change detection that we talked about. We can tell that it's definitely work in progress. Default standalone true, this is almost there. Fallback content for ng content, this came out with V18. Front-end router signal integration, we saw the first steps toward that in V18, but not much yet. Hot module replacement, still work in progress. Teaming SSR, work in progress. But you can tell that these things are moving pretty quickly. And the goal really from the Angular team, and that's important to emphasize, right? What they told us is that their goal is to build Angular for the next 10 years and ensure that it is still an excellent choice 10 years from now. That's basically their mission, right? That's how they see Angular internally at Google. And a big part of what's going on now with Angular is that the team is working closely with the Wiz team internally at Google. And that team, maybe you've never heard about it, but it's a team that's been working on things such as server-side rendering and hydration and event replay and all of these things that we start seeing popping up in Angular, and that have been used by Angular for everything pretty much that Google does: YouTube, Google Drive, Google Photos, Gmail, Google Search, all of that. And one of the first results of this collaboration was Angular signals. And Angular signals are used in 100% of YouTube right now. So when you use YouTube, you can think, oh, this is using Angular signals under the hood. So something to be proud of, I would say, because it really shows how confident Google is about these technologies. YouTube is probably one of the biggest products from Google, used by millions and millions of people all around the world every day. Performance is very important. There's so much content on YouTube. So many people rely on it for information and all of that. That YouTube is never down, and it's now powered by Angular signals. So that's a pretty big deal. And so that collaboration with the Wiz team is increasing for server-side rendering, and in the future, Wiz and Angular are most likely going to merge, and which means that everything that you use from Google right now, Gmail, Photos, Google Drive, YouTube, would be based on Angular. So it's a massive shift, right, in terms of the direction that Angular is taking, because Angular used to be one framework built by Google, but in the future, it will become something more like Angular is a framework built by Google, and that's running everything from Google. So that's a lot more impressive. And yeah, that's really where it's going now. So, when people ask me, what do you think about the future of Angular? Should we use Angular or React or Vue or something else? Well, I can tell you that Google is all in on Angular. And so that's a big vote of confidence. And really, for us, if you start an Angular app today, it's going to still be here 10 years from now, at least. So that's a pretty good, pretty positive, I would say, development in the history of Angular. And so one of the main priorities of the Angular team is always to simplify the framework, make it easier to learn, try to remove any syntax that's useless or that seems to be overkill or that doesn't help developers, I would say. So if you write a component today in Angular, you'll need things such as standalone true and provide a selector and a template. And if you have dependencies, you have to import these dependencies. So these are all things we have to learn and be aware of and not forget about. But the main goal of the Angular team is to get to a point where we just need this. And the only thing that we would add in our component decorator is a template. So no more selector, no more standalone, no more imports. All of that would go away, and the Angular compiler and the build process would know how to figure out where to find things and do its thing. So the selector would be based on the name of the component. So my component would have a selector of my component by default, for instance. And that's the idea. So this is not there yet, right? Just an example of a possibility, but that's what the Angular team is trying to achieve. That's where they're trying to go. That's their goal. So that would be a big change and really a huge simplification in the way we write Angular components. So that's part of the roadmap of what the Angular team is working on. And so that's all I had for today in terms of updates from Angular 18. So any questions? If you have questions, you can use the chat to ask them, and I'll be happy to answer. Putting some links here on the screen as well. Email address, Twitter, my blog, the link to the Angular certification. So yeah, if you need any of that, feel free to grab these links and use them. I'll go through the questions in the chat. So some of the questions I see, so non-destructive hydration plus event replay. Yes, that's what we get with Angular 18. Non-destructive hydration was already there in 17. And what we mean by non-destructive hydration is that Angular takes over the HTML that was generated on the server side instead of rebuilding everything. Before 17, it was destructive hydration. So when Angular took over, it would just rebuild the entire HTML from scratch. Now it's not doing that anymore. It's non-destructive. And an event replay is what we covered, is that if the user clicks around before the app is fully loaded, before we have event listeners and everything, it doesn't matter. These events are caught and replayed when the app is fully Angular ready. So that's what Angular 18 brings to the table. Question number 2 from Elena. Can we use input and output with custom components? Yes, you can use input and output with any component. So your own components or components from third-party libraries. And you can even pass an old style input to a new modern component that uses input function. So it's backwards compatible, basically. You don't have to migrate everything at once. You can have a mix of one and the other, and it still works. So that's good, because you can really start using it on some of your components if you want to give it a try. But there's really no difference. So it's pretty easy to make the change. The only difference is that the input you get is a signal, which, as we now know, is better for performance and enables you to use all of these new things. Another question: when we talk about server-side rendering and mention the word pre-render, does this refer to HTML being already rendered on the server and no need in client then? Yes. So what this really means is that, if you take a regular Angular app that doesn't do server-side rendering, the index HTML in that Angular app is almost empty. All we have is the app root element and then the scripts that get downloaded, and that's it. When you do server-side rendering, the index HTML has all of your pre-rendered components. So it's a much bigger HTML page because it has everything pre-rendered. And that gets downloaded to the client, displayed instantly. Then Angular loads and just takes over those HTML elements that were generated on the server side and reuses that DOM for the Angular app to work properly on the client side. So it's somewhat hybrid in a sense, because the HTML is generated on the server side, and then the client side takes over and just reuses what was pre-generated earlier. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. My email address is here, Twitter, blog. I also have a weekly newsletter that many of you are already subscribed to. If you enjoyed the session, don't forget to buy me some coffee. Put the link in the chat again to keep these sessions going every month. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending. Next month, we are going to have another session that's going to be announced very soon. But yeah, thanks everyone. And I hope to see you next month for our next monthly workshop. Bye.